Hi guys, so this is going to be our first screencast as you're working on your first hyperdoc this year. And we're going to talk a little bit about the first migrations and early migrations of the first people to come over to the Americas. Now this should be a little bit of a review. We did talk a little bit about this when you were with me in 6th grade. We talked about the early people and their migrations throughout the world. So just to kind of review and kind of refresh your memory, because I'm sure all of you remember clearly every single thing that we did in 6th grade world history. But in case you don't, right, the first people began to migrate into the Americas around 38,000 BC, almost 40,000 years ago. Now, if you remember, BCE means before Common Era, right? That is kind of our new modern politically correct way to separate time. Right now, we're in the Common Era, though we never use Common Era with our present day years. But before that, we refer to that as BCE, right? Before it was BC, but usually today what you'll find with most modern day history books will be BCE as a reference. So people began to migrate throughout Asia. Remember, our first humans are believed to have first started within Africa, and from Africa they began to spread through other parts of the world as they began to migrate, right, in search for food. So these early humans are what we refer to as nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes, right? They move from place to place in search of food and following those large herds of animals that moved across the continents. Eventually, right, we had a huge glacial period referred to as the Ice Age, and there's been many different ice ages throughout the beginning of Earth. But the one that we're referring to is the last Ice Age, which is what drove people to migrate into the Americas for the very first time. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this particular screencast. This last Ice Age that ended at around 10,000 BC is what brought groups of people coming into these areas of the Americas in search for food, right? And they all traveled here, it is believed, over this land bridge that's referred to as Beringia, or sometimes just referred to as the Bering Land Bridge, right? And this is all part of the theory that people began to migrate from this portion of Asia and moving across this land bridge, which brought them in through Alaska, and then eventually they continued to move along the North American and into the South American regions over time. Along with them were large animal herds that served as their food sources, like woolly mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers, right? These were these Ice Age animals that really became a food source for these humans. And something like a woolly mammoth was important because just one of these could actually feed a whole entire nomadic group for months at a time. So it was very important, these animals, for the life source of these groups of people. But eventually, the Ice Age, this glacial period began to end, right? Temperatures rose within the Earth, and these large chunks of ice began to melt. And with that, the oceans began to rise because now we had more water. And as the oceans rose, right, this land bridge was now covered in water, and people were cut off from being able to go back into Asia, or for any more people coming into the Americas for that matter. So they continued to migrate throughout the Americas instead. And as the temperatures became warmer, these Ice Age animals began to die out, and they were then replaced with smaller animals that were more fit to live in these now warmer temperatures. And this also affected people because as the temperatures changed and as they moved into new regions around the Americas, it also affected their way of life. It affected the types of clothing that they wore, the types of foods that they were able to eat. And so eventually these groups of people began to differ from one another, and they created their own types of cultures, in a sense, as they moved from place to place with their own types of traditions, their own types of languages, their own types of beliefs. And sometimes as they moved from area to area and the environment was so different, even their physical traits began to change because of the fact that they were affected by the environment and the things around them. And so cultures began to develop throughout the Americas, throughout North and South America as people moved. And with the creation, or with the discovery rather, of farming techniques, right? They were nomadic before, but now all of a sudden when they learned how to farm, right, especially in the Americas, one of the first things that they learned about was maize, right, or corn, beans and squash. These became one of the first foods that nomadic tribes learned to farm in the Americas. And once they learned to farm, right, that was key in having these nomadic tribes now become sedentary or stable, and now they could actually stay in one place and create societies. Right? We've had groups of people living together as a group now, forming these societies that stayed in one place. And as these societies grew and developed and became more complex, they then turned into what we refer to as civilizations. And one of the earliest civilizations that developed in the Americas is down in the area of Central America, in Mexico and Central America, which is what we call Mesoamerica. Right, we had large civilizations that developed there, and they were one of the earliest ones that developed in this area after the end of the Ice Age, and as these groups of people began to settle down and create more permanent societies. But we'll talk about that in our next screencast. Thanks for listening, guys.